So for everyone's information, this session is being recorded for documentation purposes. Today is the 20th of October. It's a Monday, and we are going to be talking about liberalism as your last school of thought for Module 2, which focuses on the traditional approaches to international security studies. Now, just a reminder, so on October 24 at 11:59 p.m., please don't forget to submit to me, to email to me your short reflection paper on Ukraine. Okay, so the based on the emails received in this regard, so far I think there's only been one group that has submitted, and that would be the group of Tyrese, Ronan, and Mikael Vargas. Once again, you have until the 24th of October to comply with this requirement. Now, if you happen to be in Thailand in the past week and missed out on the lecture with the ambassador of Ukraine, I'll give you another topic based on what you covered in your learning visit. But nevertheless, just a quick recap on what we have been doing the past few weeks. So in our activities on realism, we were able to bridge the gap or bridge our understanding of today's geopolitical issues with how state actors see the world, at least from the perspective of classical and neorealism. We learned that international tensions arise out of the state's desire to survive anarchy in the international system, whether as a result of selfish nature of mankind or the flawed structure of the international system. Okay, so by flawed, once again, by the flawed system, we're talking about an international system where there's no single actor that can hold state actors accountable to their actions and ensure that peace would be sustained. That being the case, states are likely to pursue policies that place their security and survival at the top of the pyramid, even at the expense of their neighbors or so-called allies, whom in themselves are also only trying to survive the international anarchy. Now, in liberalism, we will veer away from the skepticism of realists and try to see the world in a different light in relation to how international actors perceive threats, interact with one another, and navigate the international system. So in the next 5 minutes, I want you to think of words that you associate with liberalism. What do you recall from your foundational courses? And then after 5 minutes, we'll move back to discussion and be ready to explain what made you think of these concepts when asked about liberalism. Time starts now. So once again, please think of a word that you highly associate with liberalism, whether classical liberalism or neoliberalism, and then type them in the chat box. You don't need to explain it now. Just type in one word and that's it. Time check. You have 2 minutes, 45 seconds remaining. You have 1 minute left. Okay, time's up. Let me now go through some of the answers here in the chat box. I don't think we'd be able to go through all of them one by one, but thank you so much for sending in your response. I'd like to call on Tyrese to explain his answer. Why democracy? Like, what does democracy have to do with liberalism? Aren't democracy and liberalism essentially the same, or are they supposed to be complementary?
I would say, Miss, that it's complementary because one of the things I remember about liberalism is how, like, for example, all people should have like the right to vote in like the political dimension. So I would say that aligns with democracy.
Okay, and democracy refers to what? Is it the rule of the few, the rule of the many?
The rule of the people.
Okay. So democracy is definitely in line with liberalism in such a way that these two are considered to be complementary to each other. Democracy is associated with a type of government that is defined by the rule of the majority, right? And then on the other hand, liberalism is what is a belief that individual rights and freedoms should be protected. When you put these two together, you have a liberal democracy. Okay. Next, why don't I call upon, let's see, Kate Guevara, globalization. How would you relate globalization with either classical liberalism or neoliberalism?
I would relate the concept of globalization to neoliberalism because it opens up free trade and reduces um, trade barriers through institutions.
Okay. So globalization is also relevant to classical and neoliberalism. because it wants to encourage competition, which in itself is related to individuality, right? And the freedom to live your life the way you want to. And part of that would be, of course, protecting business interests. What else aside from that? Giving consumers more options to choose from. That's definitely at the heart of globalization itself. What about Jean Tangganan? International organizations. What do they have to do with, individual rights and freedoms, or let's say the world economy?
Hello. Is my audio noisy?
It's okay. We can hear you.
Okay, so for liberalism, what I initially thought for international organizations is neoliberalism and how it can foster free trade and open markets for multiple economies. And I think liberalism also advocates for international organizations because it can be a tool or medium to spread democratic values and ideals. For example, the SDG and the United Nations in multiple countries. So international organizations can be a great help for liberalism to spread its values and democracy, uh, free trade ideals, and other values related to democracy.
Okay. Very well then. So we're ready to move on to the next slide. So if you came up with any of the terms here on the screen, then you're likely able to, or you probably have at least a good or possible understanding of what classical and neoliberalism constitute as theories. Okay. So now, let's talk about liberalism. What is liberalism? What's classical liberalism? What's neoliberalism? Let's start with the classical one. Classical liberalism is a theory that has its underpinnings in what we call humanism. Okay. So if you remember from your history classes or from your other foundational courses, humanism emerged from when Europe was re-emerging from a period in history that was characterized by, never-ending political instability derived from the power vacuum left by the Roman Empire. Okay, and a period that was characterized by a decline in cultural and intellectual progress. We call this period the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. So after the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages came the Renaissance. And this was when humanism or the humanist philosophy was born. Okay, and the Renaissance started in Italy. So this period was known for significant developments in architecture, art, science, religion, politics, and economics. In short, it was the rebirth of culture in Europe. So we won't be discussing exactly what happened in Renaissance Europe. You're already supposed to know by this level, but more on humanism. Humanism was at the center of this period as Europe tried to reconnect with the classical world, the Greco-Roman world. That is the world that preceded the Middle Ages. Okay. Now that the political atmosphere was becoming more stable, now that the economy had evolved in a way that those who were once excluded had the opportunity to make a living out of their skills and trade, people finally had the time to think about the things that they could not prioritize during the Middle Ages. So people in the Renaissance era had a thirst to reconnect with the past. They had a thirst to learn more about the lost ancient manuscripts that scholars from previous centuries had been describing in their works. Then again, as we recall, wasn't possible to do so until Europe became more stable and more peaceful. To them, being human held a deeper meaning. Okay, it was more than just about having the ability to speak, think, write, practice faith, and do all things that distinguished us from animals. It had to do with developing an understanding of civic duties, civic virtues, and a person's ability to contribute to the betterment of society. And all that could be learned from dissecting classical literature. Again, by classical literature, we are talking about literature produced during the Greco-Roman period. In the previous era, only the elites and members of the clergy could ever hope to receive such an education. But with the restructuring of society that took place toward the end of the Middle Ages, particularly during the time of the bubonic plague, there had been a push to make the playing field more equal. And this was complemented by the idea that we shouldn't see life as though it was being run by supernatural beings. As human beings, we have control over what's happening around us, and we are capable of initiating change. So that's what humanism was about. Okay, so therefore, as you look at classical liberalism, you will see that at the center of its belief system is the picture of humans as rational actors. And by rational, this means that we act, we behave based on reason and our self-awareness that we are free to choose our path in life. Many of these values are right at home with the works of numerous ancient Greek philosophers who dared to explore the meaning of life beyond how it would have been, defined by the average Joe back then. According to liberalism, individual freedoms are tied to human happiness, which is the main point of our existence. Therefore, as rational beings, we demand that we should be allowed to express our thoughts, decide whom to love or which faith to exercise, and be represented in matters that concern our personal freedoms. For that reason, we should also demand that the laws governing us be rightly justified and that the state makes it its priority to protect the rights of individuals, without which it would be impossible to guarantee security, safety, and survival. So classical liberalism is also heavily anchored on Montesquieu's appreciation of the social contract. Again, this is not a new term. I hope you still remember the different definitions attached to social contract because it varies per thinker or philosopher. Okay, so in contrast to Thomas Hobbes' state-centric notion that the emergence of a leviathan, a person with an iron fist as a ruler is necessary to maintain peace and order, Montesquieu's version of the social contract tells us that our lives should not be torn between choosing, to follow the law or choosing to live our lives. Instead, we should be ruled by a government where the power does not solely rely on one person, okay? He did not believe in the idea of having a leviathan. Rather, there should be different branches in government that can check and balance against each other. That should ultimately lead to the preservation of our individual rights and freedoms. All clear so far? So in saying this, it's really no small wonder that classical liberals will not likely view authoritarian regimes favorably. You remember in our previous discussion, we had been talking about Kim Jong-un's regime, right? So it's not very likely that if you ask the classical liberal what they thought about Kim Jong-un, the Kim regime, that they would give a positive response. So they will not support policies that would limit the rights of individuals or encourage discrimination based on gender, race, social class, religion, or limit access to public goods and services. In other words, if realists would claim that individuals exist because of the state, because they're state-centric to begin with, this would be countered by liberals by saying that the only reason that the state exists is because of how members of society have allowed it to do so through consent, okay? Which is now at the heart or the center of how John Locke has defined the social contract, another pillar of liberalism alongside Montesquieu's social contract, okay? So according to Locke, government exists or governments exist because the people have accepted their legitimacy to rule in return for protecting their individual freedoms, like right to life, liberty, and property. This legitimacy will cease to exist once the government starts failing to hold or hold up its end of the bargain. Meaning to say, based on the perspective of John Locke, people have the right to revolt against their government if the government is no longer fulfilling its functions. Okay, and then on the other side of the coin, we have neoliberalism, whose original meaning has been lost in history after it was adopted by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to promote state policies in the United States and the United Kingdom, which claim to boost the independence of citizens through self-reliance. And you probably already know what I'm trying to drive at here, okay? Fewer state intervention for reasons you'll be finding out about later on. Now, what's common between neoliberalism and realism is that it acknowledges that anarchy exists in the international system, but it does not agree that anarchy or that war, let's say, or conflict is inevitable. It exists, it can be managed, and that's primarily because, people are rational. Actors are rational. It's essentially what it's trying to say. Now, the term neoliberalism was originally coined by Alexander Rousseau, who originally intended for the word to mean increased intervention from government by means of rules or laws on how the economy should be run. So Rousseau used to be a socialist, but yeah, he changed his mind based on his experiences. But in the interwar period, he observed that as a German living in Germany, that government intervention favored the creation of what we call monopolies instead of controlling them to keep social development across various sectors or sections of society more equal. So he wanted the government to create rules and laws that should avoid extending unfair advantages to giant corporations, as they would do little to benefit society. Today, Alexander Rousseau's neoliberalism is now known as ordoliberalism. It's a branch or a subset of neoliberalism that seeks to create a strong state structure, meaning a stable government with a balanced budget, an independent central bank, and a structure that allows for a competitive market to emerge with emphasis on merits. So ordoliberalism is an economic model that wants to create a middle ground between economic development, competition, politics, and social concerns. Okay, so this economic model traces its origins in humanism, moral philosophy, classical liberalism, and Protestantism, and believes that competition should be legally protected. Okay, without legal protections that govern how competition should transpire, then the ability of the economy and the state itself to maximize the welfare of the people would be diluted, So for supporters of ordoliberalism, which sadly is not as popular as neoliberalism, competition cannot take place at the expense of workers, taxpayers, creditors, shareholders, or what we call upstream suppliers, those who provide raw materials, components, and services to companies prior to production. Okay, so businesses should operate in a parallel direction to help the state grow. Okay, and they're not supposed to be clashing with each other. That's what ordoliberals want. And they also want ethical behavioral standards in place. Now, going back to neoliberalism, that's Thatcher's and Reagan's version of neoliberalism. It's related to classical liberalism in a way that that neoliberal policies heavily emphasize the right to private property and minimal state intervention or risk hampering growth. So it wants individuals to take the center stage. Okay, they want the individuals to use their personal choice and exercise personal responsibility over the direction in which their lives should take. In short, it takes away the responsibility of collective welfare, such as health and education and housing, from the state. It also assumes that minimal intervention over the economy is better than having a centrally planned economy. since the government cannot be trusted to handle things efficiently, specifically when it comes to allocating resources. Thus, neoliberals would promote the privatization of health, housing, education, or any other sector that the state is not very good at managing. Okay, they would favor fewer rules and restrictions to give businesses the freedom to operate more freely. They would also definitely favor the removal of tariffs or other barriers to trade because they want global economic integration. Do we have any questions so far?
None here.
Okay, if it's all good, then let's move on to this table right here. Let's have a look at threat perception within the context of liberalism in the study of international security studies. A lot of things are at stake here. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I did realize that there was one question I did want to answer or ask. It was regarding about your statement about the argument of the liberal world, right? That the state exists because we give it the consent to exist. What would be the realist's counter argument to this?
Okay, yeah. So the realist's counter argument to that would be that individuals don't generally matter in international affairs because they do not represent themselves internationally. They are represented by, their identities are superseded by the state itself. So the state with a big S. So for realists, remember the state is the single most important actor in the international system. Anyone else is not as important, even individuals. So, which is why they will not agree with liberals when it comes to, their arguments that the state only exists because, of taxpayers' money and consent. Okay? So, if that's now all good, let's move on to this table right here. Okay, so as you can see, there are different referent objects, securitizing actors, and existential threats that are indicated. For classical liberalism, humanity is under existential threat from entities, individuals, organizations that seek to reverse policies that protect the individual rights and freedoms of humans, of us, encourage political impunity and persecution, extrajudicial killings, corruption, and the whole lot. This probably sounds familiar to you too. So they see this as particularly worrying because humanity will not be able to reach its full potential in an environment that seeks to limit how they grow. Okay. So once again, we also refer to its humanist origins when it comes to finding or seeking happiness as individuals. For the neoliberals, their biggest threat should be anarchy in the international system, which could derail economic growth. Not only that, it could weaken the linkages between state and non-state actors and ultimately undo the changes that were introduced by globalization. Then again, it's up to you whether or not you think globalization is a good thing or a bad thing. Okay. Now, for the democratic peace theory, the non-democratic states, I'm also including institutional peace theory here. I'm including these two just for the purpose of discussion and to further expand your knowledge. But then again, our primary focus here would be just the first two theories. So again, for the democratic peace theory, definitely the non-democratic states are a threat since their existence opens up the possibility of disagreements and conflicts. They're just not on the same page, right? Authoritarianism, totalitarianism, dictatorships, they operate against what liberal democracies believe in, against what they envision to be a peaceful and prosperous society. So that goes without saying that if push comes to shove, democratic governments would support war. They would support violent means directed against non-democratic regimes if that means the creation of new democracies. Okay? Lastly, for institutional peace theory, we want to highlight the role of international institutions in promoting peace and reducing conflict among states, right? So for them, for this theory and the proponents of these theories, the competition, the power competition, the aggressive foreign policy tactics of certain countries would pose as an existential threat against liberal institutions. We're talking about the likes of the United Nations, European Union, NATO, ASEAN, and etc. And that's primarily because resorting to such actions will diminish the importance of dialogue, collaboration, and compromise, which are the very reasons why we have international organizations at all in this day and age. So finally, for the pros and cons, classical and neoliberalism are strong when it comes to individuality, individual expression, linkages, interdependence, the promotion of liberal democratic values and principles. And it gives a good balance against the realists' fixation on the importance of the state, because it's not really the only actor that matters out there as far as resolving issues are concerned. It would take more than the state to resolve an issue, right? So the liberals, or the liberal tradition, offers a more human-centered and inclusive approach and alternative, right? Which is useful when you're trying to look at a problem through different sectors and with other actors outside of the state or within the state in consideration. So liberalism, the liberal school of thought in general, invites other actors to take a seat at the table and be heard, which is critical in deepening our understanding of issues and how they may be resolved. However, it has its downsides too, right? The liberal assumption that actors are rational and would pursue peaceful solutions if it benefits them may not always be accurate. If you look at certain actors and the way they've been behaving, there's also a tendency for this school of thought to view things from a Western-centric perspective, where it fails to realize that liberalism and democracy are interpreted and experienced differently in other parts of the world. There is no single unifying, uniform interpretation of these two concepts, okay? Also, while there's nothing wrong with showing appreciation for the role of international institutions in mitigating conflict, this theory doesn't really dig deeply into their strengths and limitations and simply assumes that they are effective, which they're not, okay? So international institutions themselves have their own issues. But I think that it would be more appropriate to use institutionalism, new institutionalism, to deal with those issues. Then again, that's not really part of ISS. Okay, so we won't be discussing it, at least, not with a short time we have to cover everything this term. As far as democratic peace is concerned, liberalism can't fully explain why conflict is still, inevitable between democracies. And perhaps it's because it's blindsided by its assumptions that everyone has the same understanding of what liberalism and democracy are, right? And if we take that a step further, as we speak, even within liberal democracies, it doesn't seem like there's still a more concrete or unified understanding of what democratic and liberal values are supposed to represent in their own societies. Lastly, liberalism as a school of thought, alongside the theories mentioned during this discussion, may be perceived as a tool of new imperialism. Again, this isn't a new term. So gone are the days where the great powers exercise direct control over the territories, populations, and resources of the global south. But it doesn't mean to say they have not discovered new ways to keep us dependent on them. Okay? With that being said, we're done with discussing liberalism. It's now time to open the floor to questions, to comments. Yes, Ronan.
Okay, so in terms of what you had mentioned about some of the flaws of liberalism, right? And like namely how liberalists tend not to agree with anyone that isn't who isn't subscribed to the idea of liberalism as well. If I could use an example, Singapore technically is a bit of a mix between a realist and a liberalist. They do understand the importance of working with other countries, but they do lack certain freedoms, as Singapore is technically an autocracy. But despite it being an autocracy, they do follow many customs that is found within democracies. It's just that the people have essentially come to see that uh, the best way that things have been going right now is by this autocratic government. Though right now things might be changing due to new circumstances, this has been the same thing that they've believed in. So to kind of put that onto point, or to like put it back to the original topic, wouldn't you say then that that certain failures of liberalism could be, how do I put this? Could be rectified by having a realistic approach?
Okay, yeah, that's actually right. When you look at Singapore as an actor, and other actors in general, other state actors, we have to realize that we can't put all of them in just a single box, that we just primarily associate them with certain approaches to international relations, or label them directly as being realist or liberal or social constructivist, because they could be all of these things at the same time. Okay, so these states will use whatever is in their toolbox, any lens that would fit their narrative, that would also align with their aspirations as a state actor. So definitely when we're talking about Singapore itself, it may not necessarily be on the same level of democracy as, let's say, European countries, but it's also a democracy. It's also considered as a democracy. So let's look at democracy as a gradient instead of like a box that you just check or uncheck. So there are some democracies that are stricter in nature. There are some democracies that are freer in nature. And I would say that Singapore is probably going to be at the stricter, on the central and stricter side of that spectrum. But nevertheless, it's a symbol that, or it's a case that tells us that democracy can be combined with different types of political models, right? So the politics and democracy may not be as free as in the Philippines, but they do have parliament where people can talk about issues affecting their, or where representatives can talk about the issues affecting their constituents. So yeah, I mean, it's possible, and liberalism in this case primarily refers to countries that are subscribing to liberalism and democracy within the sense of what fits the Western standards. So we're not technically referring to Singapore in this discussion, but it's good that you mentioned that, so that everyone in class can understand that different types of democracies can exist. There are also, socialist democracies. There are other, types of guided democracies. So democracy can be interpreted in different ways depending on, let's say, the geographic region, location, the history of a state actor, and etc. Yeah, good question. Do we have other questions in relation to democracy, liberalism, neoliberalism? By the way, the theory that I was referring to when we were discussing liberalism, the subset of liberalism, in case you're interested in learning more about it, would be ordo liberalism. I'm typing it into the chat box. Once again, ordo liberalism, it's not as popular as it has its origins in Germany. So perhaps in the future, you'd like to pursue advanced political economy studies. It might come up so that it's nothing new to you by then. Okay. Now, if there are no questions, I do have one question that I'd like to ask people in this class. I'd like to ask to everyone. Okay. So there's this notion among Filipinos that electing another strongman to power would bring us out of our misery, meaning that, having a strong leader who can tell anyone what to do would necessarily translate to economic prosperity, peace, and unity. I want to know your take on that. Does that argument work? So once again, the Philippines needs a strongman to lift itself out of poverty and political stability. Do you personally agree or disagree with that? What would a classical liberal say? And what would a neoliberal say about this statement? And that being said, I'm creating 5 breakout rooms where you will be assigned automatically. So I'm giving you until 3:50 to finish discussing among yourselves. I'll be taking a peek at each one of the breakout rooms. So please make sure that you're able to convey your thoughts. Wait, let me just type in the question that everyone is supposed to answer and discuss by taking turns in the breakout rooms. So please take good note of that. So that would be your discussion point. That's the topic that you're supposed to relate to classical liberalism and neoliberalism. Vince, if you're listening, you're supposed to be in room 1. Gian, you're supposed to be in room 2. Please join your respective rooms. Mikhail, you should be in room 3.
And that is Duterte, correct? So it never having a strong man needs a balance, someone who knows how to statecraft, and instead of someone that knows how to brute force everyone out of poverty. That's uh, the quality of a president. For classical liberalists, that would entail that the rights of the people will be uh, will be th- will be tossed around the wayside in the pursuit of the strongman's ideals of a ideal country. Like Duterte, the exemplified strongman, um, hindi lang tayo nalubog sa utang na nag-increase din ang EJK when it comes to uh, alleged drug users. Then the next is neoliberalist. For I think the neoliberalists would also disagree, since what the strongman wants is to uh, become more enclosed, become more isolated from.
Um, would you, Angelica and Jose, would you, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Angelica.
So for my understanding, according to the neoliberal perspective, the claim that the Philippines needs a strong man is flawed because the strong leader may impose a short-term order, and I think lasting prosperity and stability comes from this is for neoliberal perspective, that lasting prosperity and stability comes from strong institution, transparent government, and citizen participation, and not on the concentrated power.
How about you, Thea?
I agree with statements earlier that we don't exactly need a strong man leader, more so. Na we need a more open hand, empathetic na leader, especially one that is research based na governance. But yeah.
I think if, yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry, I don't know. I raised my hand. I could just speak up, but I wanted to say, to answer the third question, would a neoliberal agree to that statement? Okay, before I answer this question, I just wanted to ask for like a clarification. From my understanding of neoliberalism in security, in specifically in international security, it's all about putting rules and laws in place to have checks and balances so that bigger parties don't undermine the individuals of the state. And neoliberalism in security, in international security, is all about fighting against, I guess, exploitation to the individuals, right?
You're saying that neoliberalism is fighting exploitation?
No,
Did I
it
hear you right?
not necessarily fighting exploitation, but having rules and laws in place to make sure bigger parties, bigger leaders
Mm.
don't undermine individuals. Essentially, the government doesn't take advantage. The government of the state or the state itself doesn't take advantage of its people.
I think my personal opinion is that the necessity to have a strong man comes out from the institutional frustration of Filipinos regarding the changes that are not happening. Like with the current corruption problems, there was actually a lot of expert opinion that if the changes or reform are not institutionalized, the Filipinos would just simply give up fighting for change. And so I think from that frustration, rooted in that frustration is the sentiment that there needs to be a very strong leader that could actually make this change happen. But I think it's a flawed perspective because strongman leadership is actually rooted in authoritarian streaks. Like it banks on populist um, uh, strategies, like they're trying to exploit the current vulnerability of the population. They're trying to say that we could solve this, I'm the one who's going to solve this. But at the same time, especially from the classical liberalist perspective, they would actually reject this idea because they wanted to uphold human rights, they wanted to uphold free election. And a leader with an authoritarian streak would not probably allow for these things to happen or not uphold this to the highest degree. For the neoliberalists, I don't think they would hold.
Ay,
I'll share.
ayun.
Are you done discussing?
Or wrapping it up na po, Chair. Sige, go ahead, Fifi. Continue.
No, I was just about to say that when we were learning Intrella, we
Mm.
were um it was just the school of thought of liberalism, and so sometimes like I don't
Mhm.
get confused about where classical liberalism ends and where neoliberalism starts.
Oo, I see, I see. Pero yun nga, parang as we've mentioned earlier, parang a classical, or perhaps also a modern liberal, diba? They would really strongly disagree. Right?
Right. Um,
Conditional lang, but that's leading towards a no pa rin. So, to bagay. Ayun. Any thoughts, friends?
I think we've discussed a while ago what the very ano na laman ng thoughts natin. Chair, are we supposed to be presenting?
Well, no, you don't need to present later on, but I'll be randomly calling up people to say their piece about the topic, just so that you can share with us, what you discussed with your group, but no formal presentation whatsoever. It's not needed. But then again, to answer your question about, the distinction between classical liberalism and neoliberalism, classical liberalism is the one that emphasizes on human rights, individual liberties, freedoms, etc. When you're talking about neoliberalism, it wants to focus on the efficiency of the economy. It's
Mm.
business. So it doesn't always have human rights in mind, as you will later on figure out for yourselves. Okay, so I'm going to need you guys to do the reading materials and do some additional research. Plus, I believe that I shared some videos, some recorded lectures. So I think you'd find what you're looking for in one of those videos. Yeah, in probably
Yes.
module 0 or module 1.
Yes, ma'am. Thank
Okay,
you, Chair.
Thank
all
you,
right.
Chair.
Hello, guys. Are you all done discussing your thoughts?
Chair, we're down to the last question, which is about neoliberalism.
Okay. So, yeah, feel free to continue. I'm just here listening in. Hey guys, are you all done discussing your perspectives?
No share. We had a discussion a while ago, so I think we're technically done, but we still haven't inputted our answers in the docs.
Okay, I mean, I'm not going to be asking for like a formal presentation. It's going to be more like I'd be calling random people um, later on when we'll go back to the main meeting room, just so that you could discuss what you guys talked about, which ideas or perspectives stood out, so on and so forth. Okay.
Hello, guys. Can you also feel free to answer the two questions on classical and neoliberal, so I can
Sorry, my
substantiate later.
internet's been a little chop. Yeah,
Yeah.
my internet's been a little choppy. Sorry.
What? Can you repeat? Hello, can you repeat? Sorry, I'm on my phone right now.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, sorry. My internet connection is really unstable.
Hello, you're quite choppy. Can you repeat?
No, I said my connection's really bad. I can't properly talk.
It's okay. If it's okay, I can just speak for you guys. Para
Okay.
or
Sige. I'll just try to write in
if
my
namali ako ng rinig, is is every one of us, or everyone, with every one of us, like, present, or isa lang as a speaker, like, to represent our group?
Hi, Jean. Only one from each group is fine. So, I mean, it could be two. It really depends on who I end up calling. Okay. So, yeah, see you in a while.
This is noted, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, I suppose everyone's now back from the meeting rooms, the breakout rooms. Let's now proceed with answering the question. Do we really need another strongman to lift us out of poverty so that we can also attain political stability? Would anyone like to volunteer or share their thoughts? Remember, there are no right or wrong answers to this question. It really depends on how you would qualify your answers. Okay, Rafael.
Hello po, Chair. So, in the group, we've defined two types of a strong man. The first strong man is the one that's more authoritarian and more concerned um in the future, more concerned on increasing their grip on society or in the nation as a whole. In An example of this could be Duterte. He was labeled as a strong man by the Filipino and the voters since his policies aimed towards killing uh, drug users and drug abusers. And this uh, this type of policy hinders classical liberalists in practicing. This hinders the rights of the Filipino, or the rights the of the people in general, of their freedoms. And these policies indicate much more assertiveness in part of the government that could hinder the rights of the people. Now, neoliberalists in this concept will also disagree, since um, it's more uh, in part of protecting the economy of the state or of the nation, and would rather have isolationist economic policies rather than opening its borders towards trade. To going back to Duterte, instead of having multilateral or treaties or cooperation with other nations or with traditional Philippine allies, we instead pivoted towards China and only let Chinese investors empower our economy. While for my other group members, such as Mr. Wong and Mrs. Guevara's answer, they envision a strong man that has a strong backbone when it comes to international relations and when it comes to representing the the rights or the rights of the people. And uh, if this strongman is capable of creating policies that uh, won't let the Philippines get the short end of the stick, uh, it would positively impact, or it would lift us out of the lift us out of poverty. And for classical liberalists, this kind of leader is uh, is needed, since he is the de facto defender of their constitution and represents everyone, the man of the people per se. However, neoliberalists think that maybe some of these policies might be a bit erratic, and uh, ra- and the economic policies of this leader might still be on the isolationist side, or become just pick one country to trade with Pope. That is all.
Okay, thank you for that. So room one is clear. What about those who are assigned in room two? I think there are only three people there: Azura, Granfield, and Albania. Who would like to take over? Yeah, okay, King.
Alrighty, hi chair. Sorry. So as a group, we have convened to disagree. It would be similar to a classical liberals' position on the matter. So as we have discussed in the Philippines, also mentioned by the previous group, we've seen strongmen hold grip of power, and it's true. It always end up in abuse of power and authoritarianism. Perhaps one can argue that it can offer economic stability, but in reality, is only temporary. But for long term, it would only create stagnation and inequality. So, to answer the question, a classical liberal would disagree because it mainly believes in limited government, rule of law, and individual freedom. However, a neoliberal would, I would dare to say, partially it would agree, but only conditional, because it supports strong leadership only if it promotes free market reforms. But it's only that part, but in totality, it would totally disagree, because even if they prioritize market, they would still rather favor institutions that promote competition, free trade, and open markets. So, in general, both would disagree to that statement.
Okay, thank you for that, King. Who would like to speak on behalf of room three? That's Danganan, Hogar, Vargas, Lim. Any volunteers from that group? Yes, go ahead, please, Jean.
Hello, ma'am. Sorry. So for our discussion a while ago, we really had diverse opinions regarding strong men, but in totality, we disagreed that strong men can be mediums of change, especially when it comes to countries that are unstable and live in ardent poverty. So for me personally, I think strongmen are usually seen as change makers for needed reforms. However, personally, they can also be used as a tool to forward populist ideals, impunity, and a culture of violence, which may impede the progress of a nation. So strongmen can usually lean on ideals that are not sustainable, based on equity and justice, and worsens bureaucratic issues. On the other hand, other people in my groups, for example, agree to a certain extent that strongmen can also be used as strongmen can be like guided by integrity and a clear developmental vision, enforce discipline, and streamline government processes, and push through long-delayed reforms. Uh, so that's like one of the points that advocates or agree that strongmen for yield many of the public and also government officials and units to enforce these such reforms. On the other hand, others also disagree that uh, we don't need a strong man, but it may help to a certain extent uh, uh, help the nation to forward some ideals. So in total, I think it's a very mixed response, although we can agree that strong leaders can bring order and bring some change. Usually, especially when it comes to Philippine history, it doesn't always bring the much needed progress to change and uplift people from poverty, since it can also create a culture of impunity and may offset some progressive ideals.
Okay, thank you. Room 4, who's speaking on this group's behalf? This is a group of Nang, Lego, Alporte, and Australia. And then we'll end with room 5 later on. So please determine who will be speaking on your behalf as well. That's a group of Nadong, the Guzman Delphin, and Tyrese Lim. Nina?
Hi, Sharon, everyone else. So I would just like to concur with the other groups who disagreed with the notion that the Philippines needs a strongman leader for a, for the country to be lifted out of poverty and for there to be put to have political stability. Because if history taught us one thing, we already had strong leaders in the past. We had Ferdinand Marcos, we have Rodrigo Duterte. We already experienced what it's like to be under those leaders. And I don't think we need another one to assure ourselves that we could they're actually the leaders that we need for the Philippines progress. But in the classical liberalist perspective, it would be a resounding no for strongman leaders, especially if they have authoritarian streaks or their platforms or their advocacies are rooted in populist ideas. But in the neoliberalist perspective, upon current research right now, I actually figured out a very interesting take where they would neither agree or disagree with the strongman because in all the administrations that came after Ferdinand Marcos, who actually purported a neoliberalist um, agenda in terms of economic policies, that has been continued across different administrations, whether the president was a strong man or not. And I think that was rooted in the argument that the neoliberalist policies were depoliticized. It was actually outside of the politics context. And so maybe we could argue based on this study that the neoliberalist take would be they would not care whether it's a strawman leader at the helm or not because it's already been deeply ingrained into the system, especially into the economic system of the Philippines, and would more likely to continue whether the leader is a strongman or not.
Okay, thank you for that, Nina. What about the last group? Who will be speaking? Nadong, please go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So obviously, I think whatever I'm about to say has already been said for us collectively as a group. On the first question, we disagree that we need a strong man for the Philippine stability and prosperity. Why? Because we believe that it's not something that can be done by one person. And as mentioned by Alforte, we've already had our fair share of strongman leadership. So uh, it's also important for us to consider that corruption and systemic instability has already been ingrained in Philippine politics. So even if we depend on the strongman's policies, it's not a sure indicator that it will lead us to prosperity. So for our take on classical liberalism, uh, it's obviously classical liberalism would obviously be against the strongman. As what has been said before, when we think about strongman, we think about Duterte and what has happened during his term. We saw the erosion of public trust. We saw weakened institutions like the media freedom. Everyone was getting a red tag. Erosion of human trust, the EJK. So these are all things that liberalism stands for. And a strongman, basically, we argue that change should be made through processes by multiple people and not just unilateral decision making by one person. And as for neoliberalism, I also thought about how neoliberalism might tolerate a strongman in the name of stability, economically speaking. But in terms of sustainability in the long run, politically also, it might not hold up. But all in all, we also disagree because neoliberalism stands for little government intervention. That's what one of my group mates said. And also, he made mention of how efficiency naturally emerges from the system as opposed to government forcing it. And just to wrap it all up, neoliberalism believes that rather than relying on power or coercion, the stability and prosperity that we speak of essentially arises from institutions and the cooperative systems that exist between them. That's all po.
Okay, thank you. I think that all five groups have spoken, have said their piece about the question on whether or not we actually need another strongman to lift us out of poverty, and so that we become a rich country one day, right? The answers are very obvious, and that is, based on your answers, having a strongman does not guarantee peace and prosperity. Like what you said, it's happened many times before, not just in the Philippines, but also in various parts of the world, with the same results: increased debt, rampant corruption, diverted funds for infra and social development, weaker investments. There's also the dimension on human rights, the oppression of human rights and freedoms create an atmosphere of distrust and resentment that could eventually, if compounded with the other issues mentioned a while ago, bring forth a revolution and a political collapse. And once a political collapse happens, unfortunately, it does not always guarantee that, there would be a more democratic government ready to replace the authoritarian one, and that there would necessarily be a prosperous economy. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. Okay, as to whether or not electing someone to power just because they look like they can do things, it's not really a very good idea. So, dictatorships or authoritarian rule create and enable extractive institutions that will continue to favor a small portion of the population. Okay, and that is so that the leader stays in power, and there will come a time where there is nothing more to extract from these institutions or through these institutions, right? Because every time this is done, the longer you do this, acts of corruption, so on and so forth, these things will weaken our institutions, but they will also weaken our social safety nets. At the same time, they will prevent us from developing alongside our neighbors, our trade partners, and allies. So yeah, it's not really such a good idea. But just to give you a case, right? In our previous module, we also talked about the Kim regime in North Korea, and in that module, under realism, we were able to identify the strategy that Kim Jong Un, that one main strategy that Kim Jong Un has been using to get what he wants, right? And that's through nuclear blackmail. So he would use nuclear weapons, the tests, the program, the development to threaten their neighbors to get what they want, whether in the form of money, aid, or investment. In doing so, Kim Jong-un is able to what? Come up with the resources to maintain the confidence of the political and military elite within North Korea because he needs them to what? To stay in power. He would use the money to literally buy expensive bottles of alcohol like Hennessy. I'm not kidding. This is where the money goes. He would also buy luxury bags like Louis Vuitton and etc. And then they would remove the branding and replace that with, I don't know, the logo of North Korea. They'd be handed out to the wives of these generals and other political leaders. They would be housed in apartments in exclusive areas. And he needs to do all of that to make sure that they stay happy because they're the ones keeping him in power to begin with, okay, while the rest of the North Koreans starve to death. So once he loses them, right, once he loses their favor, there's a chance that they would rise or conspire against him one by one. And it might result into the collapse of North Korea and the Kim regime. It might also result into someone else replacing the Kim regime if um, if it wouldn't be possible for, let's say, the North and South Koreas to reunify under one rule. Now, to also echo your answers, classical liberals would be abhorred at the idea of a strongman leading the Philippines once again, because it's a danger to individual freedoms, as if we haven't learned enough from our past two experiences, right? Under a dictatorship, under an authoritarian rule, there's no accountability to anyone from the end of the leader, right? It would create a system that is prone to human rights violations in the name of prosperity and peace, which in the end would achieve the opposite, right? So neoliberals themselves too would not be too happy since centrally planned economies go against its beliefs that the government should take the back seat when it comes to running the economy. They want businesses to innovate on their own and compete with one another to give consumers the best option possible. And this doesn't really happen in centrally planned economies where the state controls how each sector functions, how much investment one receives. If anything, many centrally planned economies are more interested in propping up their regimes than bolstering the economy or making themselves more globally competitive. And being globally competitive also means, opening up to the rest of the world, abiding by international norms and standards. When you look at it, they don't really blend in well with authoritarian aspirations all that much. But, you could also say that there are some exemptions to the rule, right? Maybe it could work for some, but it's really more of an exemption than rule. So China, for instance, it could be argued that it's a hybrid, that at some point it's also practicing neoliberalism while having an authoritarian government. Maybe you could argue that China is an ordoliberal authoritarian government, right? It has a strong state structure to support the economy. It has some room for competition. It's able to create conditions for companies within China to compete against one another through a series of laws and restrictions and regulations. And they're doing that by also, or as they practice authoritarian policies. Okay, do as the leader says or be wiped out of the competition. But in China's case, in China's centrally planned economy, everything is centered on how the economy could help China achieve its political goals, but specifically how the CCP could continue to remain in power and unchallenged by other political parties or entities. Okay, so the economy is planned, I think, about every 5 years or so under the same political party, and they have a rather, expansive and rigorous succession plan in place. And that's not something that you'd always see in other dictatorships or other less democratic forms of government whose economies are planned around, the strongman's wishes and mood swings and who they wanted to curry favor to. And that's what sets China apart. They do have a specific system in place for planning how their economy would grow, how they would modernize their military, how their political succession would be taking place. Okay. And that being said, thank you so much for participating during discussion. I really appreciate your thoughts and how you applied liberalism. Now, next meeting, we will be talking about how or what you need to do to prepare for your upcoming debate. As mentioned last time, those who ranked at the bottom of our previous activity will be given roles that are fixed, while the rest of you would have the freedom to choose your role and which people you'll be grouping with. Just to give you an idea, for every debate, there would be a set of 8 speakers. So there will be 4 speakers on each side. Then there will be a topic, and this topic, as also previously mentioned, will be related to the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you on the next session. And also, just to remind you, it will be taking place online as well. Okay, so we will be meeting online once again, but then next week, that's when we go back to meeting face to face once again. So thank you and take care. If you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Feel free to send me an email. Bye-bye.